We are going to cover a lot about this stage during the rest of our course. So for now, let's learn two important concepts regarding testing and then move to a quick overview about this stage. Code freeze. First, let's define a test environment. Brain positioning. The test environment is the software or hardware combo where the software is tested before we release it. Usually, when referring to the test environment, we just mention the name of an internal website for testing. For example, if the URL of the test environment is main.sharelane.com, then you can say, "I found a bug on main." Let's look at real-life situations that happen at software companies. Example, the tester has executed 30 of 40 test cases, all clear, no bugs. Without notifying him, the developer makes a change in his code and pushes it to the test environment where the tester runs his test cases. The tester executes the 10 last test cases and gives the green light for a release to production. The release is a disaster because the code changed after the test cases were already executed and the tester didn't know. Code freeze takes place when we decide to apply strict rules to any code modification. If the code is frozen, a developer cannot change it unless he follows a special procedure. We'll talk about the technical details of the code freeze during our lesson about releases. Code freeze is needed to provide a tester with a stable environment and allow testing of a stable application version. Even a tiny change in software code can create a number of disastrous P1 bugs, and hence you could say that the code is tested and ready for release only if it wasn't changed after your testing. Brain positioning. Each bug has a priority which reflects that bug's importance for the company's business. Priorities usually range from P1 to P4, with P1 being the most critical. For example, if user cannot register, it's P1. If HTML link has navy color instead of blue, it's probably P4. We'll talk more about bug priorities later on. Remember this for the rest of your testing career. Before you start testing, make sure that, first, the code is frozen. Second, the test environment has the correct version of the code to test. Remember to check these two things every time prior to testing. Let's illustrate the point about checking for the correct version of the code to test. Example, we have two test environments on the intranet, everest.sharelane.com, elbrussharelane.com. These two websites are used for internal testing only and are not available to users. Let's assume that everest.sharelane.com has code version 1.0. elbrus.sharelane.com has code version 2.0. There is often a situation when the same functionality, let's say checkout, has an absolutely identical font and an absolutely different backend between the old 1.0 and the new 2.0 versions. Therefore, if a tester doesn't specifically check to see if the test environment has the correct version, he can end up testing the wrong version because the front end looks the same. This mistake is often made by both beginners and experienced testers. That's why it's very important to always check to see if the test environment has the correct version of the software to test. So what happens if a tester needs to test version 2.0 but erroneously uses everest.sharelane.com for testing? Two things. One, a waste of testers' time. If we are going to release version 2.0 but erroneously test version 1.0, it doesn't make much sense. Two, the risk of releasing untested code to our users because version 2.0, which was supposed to be tested, wasn't tested. As you can see, negligence in checking the version of the code to be tested can have very negative consequences. Sad things like testing the wrong version take place because of a tester's negligence, but other factors like illogical names of test environments can also contribute to the situation. Here's how to prevent this. 1. Ask your release engineer how to find out the current code version in the test environment and apply this knowledge every time before testing. 2. Ask your IT engineer about choosing logical names for test environments. An IT person can enjoy whatever he likes, for instance, mountain climbing, but it's difficult to understand the difference between Everest and Elbrus when talking about a version of software. Let's create two test environments instead. old.sharelane.com for the application version which is currently on our live site, www.sharelane.com. So if a bug is released to our users, we have old.sharelane.com to test a bug fix before releasing that bug fix to production. Between ourselves, we can call this test environment old. main.sharelane.com for the application version of the coming release. The testers do testing on main.sharelane.com, and when we are ready for the release, the live site, www.sharelane.com, will get the version of the software accepted for release on main.sharelane.com. Between ourselves, we can call this test environment main. 3. If the current way of finding out the version of the code and the DB is not convenient, for example, you always have to go and ask the release engineer about those versions, suggest that he implements one of the following. A. Add a web page with information about the release version, the build number. We'll learn about this in the next lesson. The DB schema version. We'll learn about this in the next lesson. For example, if this is implemented, you can go to the page main.sharelane.com/version.txt and see something like this. Release version 1.0, build number 23, DB schema version 34. Important, the version of the code or the version of test environment consists of the three components above. Remember to check for these three things every time before you start testing. We'll elaborate more about each component soon. B. Another good approach is to include information about the current version as a comment written into the HTML code of each web page. Example, go to main.sharelane.com and view the page source. You can find application version of Sharelane looking into HTML of any web page on main.sharelane.com. Exception is test portal pages. By the way, from now on, let's call the full version of our code the application version. At Sharelane, we specify application version in this format: major release number, minor release number, build number, DB version number. We'll talk about release type soon. From sanity test to certification test. After the developers have finished writing the code, the release engineers make it available for the testers in the test environment, main.sharelane.com. The testers perform a quick smoke test, also called a sanity test or confidence test, to check if the software is testable. Example, if we cannot log into the account on main.sharelane.com, we simply cannot proceed with test case execution. In other words, the software is not testable. If the smoke test fails, we communicate this to the programmers and release engineers. There can be an error on the release engineering side, and they work to fix the problem. Once the problem is fixed, we perform the smoke test again. This mini-cycle takes place until the smoke test passes. Once the smoke test passes, release engineer declares code freeze, and testers start new feature testing by executing test cases written for this release. Found bugs are filed into the bug tracking system. The programmers fix them, and the testers verify those fixes. After the new feature testing is finished, the testers start to test the old features. As you remember, this type of testing is called regression testing. Regression testing is performed to check if code modifications made for this release have broken something in the old features. After we are finished with new feature testing for Release 2.0, we are going to use our test cases written for Release 1.0 for regression testing. By the way, does this mean that during regression testing for Release 25.0, we have to execute all test cases from Releases 1.0 to 24.0 inclusively? No, but this question reflects one of the most difficult problems in software testing, and we'll address it later on. Once the regression testing is done, there is usually a concrete deadline. Testers perform an acceptance testing, also called a certification testing. During acceptance testing, the testers execute a special set of P1 test cases. often in form of checklists. Do ad hoc testing, undocumented testing based on intuition and inspiration. Sometimes when a young startup has an important release, for example, its first release, the whole company stays overnight to do acceptance testing. Once the acceptance testing is finished, PMs, testers, developers, release engineers, managers get together for a go, no-go meeting. At this go, no-go meeting, the team decides if the code is ready to be released to the production environment, also called production or prod or live, so the users can enjoy the results of our work. If it's a go, the release engineers release the code to prod. If it's a no-go, the responsible parties stop sleeping until the issues are resolved. Once all the issues are resolved, there is another go, no-go meeting, and so on until release to prod takes place. Lesson recap. 1. The test environment is the software-hardware combo where the software is tested before we release it. 2. The code freeze takes place when we decide to apply strict rules to any code modification. 3. The code freeze is needed to provide a tester with a stable environment and allow him to test a concrete application version. 4. Each bug has a priority that reflects that bug's importance for the company's business. Priorities usually range from P1 to P4, with P1 being the most critical. 5. Before you start testing, make sure that 1. The code is frozen. 2. The test environment has the correct version of the code to test. Remember to check these two things every time prior to testing. 6. Ask your IT guy to give logical names to test environments like main, old, current, future, etc. 7. Info about the application version should be easily discoverable. 8. At ShareLane, we keep application version in the following format: major release number, minor release number, build number, DB version number. 9. We start testing with smoke test to see if software is testable. That's when all main features like login work. 10. We also call that the smoke test or sanity test or confidence test. 11. After a smoke test passes, we do new feature testing. If we test release 2.0, new feature testing covers features written for release 2.0. 12. After new feature testing, we start regression testing. If we test release 2.0, regression testing covers features written for release 1.0. 13. After regression testing, we do acceptance testing, also called a certification testing, to see the general health of the application. 14. After the acceptance test is done, we attend a go, no-go meeting and decide if we want to proceed with release. 15. The production environment is also called prod or live.